We're very lucky to have the distinguished economist Miguel Kiguel here to talk to us about the current state of Argentina's economy, the outlook for the future, and to answer questions.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's a pleasure to be with you guys, and we hope that this is we jumpstart a good relationship and good dialogue about Argentina and other topics as well. In terms of Argentina, I would say clearly the scene today is dominated by the issue of the debt. The debt restructuring continues to be center stage in Argentina, and there, we seem to be very close. When you look at the numbers that separate what the government is offering and what the bondholders are requesting is something like $5, which is not a big difference, and one would expect that by now that that they should reach an agreement. And what's separating them? One thing is obviously the value of the offers, whether the NPV is going to be at a 10% discount rate, is going to be 50 as the government is saying, or maybe 60 as some of the bondholders are saying. But when you look at the numbers, really, it's really a $5 difference. In fact, and you would expect at some point you would split difference and find some agreement in the middle. There are also some legal differences, differences on legal issues, particularly because some bonds, the ones that were issued in 2005 and 2010, have the indentures that are more favorable to the creditors, that protect them more. And given that Argentina has defaulted so many times, probably the creditors want to maintain them. If you think, my sense is that we should find a solution. The new deadline is July 24. Whether it's going to be July 24, whether it's going to be August, we don't know. But I think that it makes sense to reach an agreement. And at least in my mind, is that we're not going to see a sea change in economic conditions in Argentina the day after. First of all, Argentina has a large fiscal deficit in a country that doesn't have and will not have for some time access to international markets and to the markets in general. The deficit is going to be around 5% of the primary is going to be around 5% of GDP. The overall deficit around 6.5% of GDP, at least this year, and that's today is being entirely financed through the central bank. So I think that the government needs to basically start a fiscal adjustment sometime next year to bring down the deficit at least 3 percentage points of GDP. So the second challenge is there is a money overhang, as we say. So there's much more money today in the economy that that we need to function. And the question, and if that money is not removed quickly, I think that the risk of inflation is very high. In fact, I do think that inflation that last year was 55%, this year is going to be north of, it's going to be somewhere between 45 and 50%, which is a very high number. And so clearly the central bank has a big challenge there. The third issue is the exchange rate. Argentina at the moment has a very tight foreign exchange controls. The exchange rate, we have the exchange rate is overvalued at least if you look in terms of the spread between the official exchange rate and what we call the parallel exchange rate, which is legal, which is the blue chip swap. The spread is roughly 50%. At some point was 75%, and I think that if things do not improve, that the likelihood is that we're going to go back to a larger spread. The central bank will have a tough decision because probably what happens in these scenarios is that the central bank ends up with a devaluation. The devaluation is not going to be huge, but could be somewhere in the range of 20 to 30%. And that is going to spark inflation again, and it's difficult to do it when you have the lockdown, which is a very severe lockdown in Argentina, with people, under stress in terms of their income. And if inflation goes up in that environment, there's a big risk of social unrest. So it's a very difficult situation in which the government is in, and it's unclear how it will be able to deal with this issue. The day after they reach the agreement with the bondholders, they will start to negotiate an IMF program. Why? Because Argentina doesn't have really an economic plan. We don't know. We don't have a budget, for instance. We have a lot of frozen prices, frozen utility rates, frozen many prices of staples, frozen prices of medicines. And we know that those prices need to be adjusted because as the exchange rate moves, many of those prices have imported inputs, and they need to be adjusted as well. So clearly, the next challenge is to have a macroeconomic program, which will not be easy because it has to reduce the deficit by 3% of GDP at the times when the economy is still under a lot of pressure in terms of economic activity. Tax revenues drop dramatically, so they have to come back. And they need to get the exchange rate right. So clearly, it's an economy under a lot of challenges. It's not that you solve the debt and the next day you go to the new normal, unless you think that the new normal is big disequilibria in Argentina.
It strikes me that inflation is being kept in check by the fact, partly, that there's this very strict quarantine in place, that obviously there's a recession, that there are price controls, utility tariff freezes, and yet monetary emission is colossal. I mean, do you think that they're not just storing up an inflation problem in the future, but potentially a hyperinflationary spiral might be in the cards?
There are two parts. First, is inflation. Is the inflation that we see is kind of checked because of the lockdown? The answer is yes. The lockdown is clearly affecting aggregate demand, so people are not spending. Many of them simply because their income has come down in spite of the increase in the money supply. Second, a lot of those pesos are at the moment, especially by corporations, but also by some individuals, being held for precautionary reasons. People, you don't know, you need cash today, the banking system is not working fluently. So clearly there's more need for cash for individuals, and people have cash for precautionary purposes. I mean, just as an example, many small businesses around my neighborhood, they only take cash for your payment. So there is a reason why people are holding more cash and companies are holding more pesos than usual, in part also because they cannot buy dollars. So the companies are holding those pesos, waiting for the time they can buy dollars or for the time when they're going to be able to use it. Now, eventually, I mean, the CEPO, the foreign exchange controls, will remain in place, and that means that more demand for pesos will be there because people will not be, for instance, have some clients which are importers, and they cannot use their dollars because the government doesn't allow them to pay imports abroad. As a result, those pesos are stuck in Argentina. Now, there is a risk that inflation is going to go up, and most likely inflation is going to go up once the lockdown is relaxed and the economy moves more normal. Your question, Nicolas, is whether this is going to be hyperinflation. I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so with the information I have today, which is a fiscal deficit, a primary of 5% of GDP this year, moving down to around 2% of GDP next year, okay? If that's the case, I think that we're going to see more than a hyperinflation is a jump in inflation, a one-time jump in inflation, where it can go up somewhere between 50 and 70 or 80%. I mean, it's difficult to know the number, and then it will go down. That happened in the past many times. When you have typically it happens, the trigger of the increase in prices is a devaluation of the currency. In the end, the story would be worked somewhere as follows. The government prints money, that money, there's too many pesos, eventually that leads to an increase in the parallel exchange rate. Once the gap between the official and the parallel becomes large enough, 60, 70, 80%, the central bank cannot buy reserves, cannot buy dollars because exporters don't export, importers try to get as much as they can. I don't know, there are many mechanisms, but somehow the central bank stops buying, starts losing reserves. Reserves are already very low, so if they lose reserves very quickly, we get into trouble. And the way to reduce this gap between the official and the parallel rate is to devalue. I mean, that happened many times in the past, happened in 2014, in 2016, and whenever, so that's, in my view, is going to happen. And once you devalue, inflation is going to pick up. So workers at the moment are going to be more concerned about keeping their job, keeping their income, than about, you know, asking for wage increases. So I think that the risk is there. I think it's very small at the moment of a hyperinflation, which is a runaway inflation. Now, the risk of a kind of a jump in inflation, that's clearly something that I see in the next 12 months sometime. The central bank is taking a very conservative, very kind of prudent view there, which I don't share. I think it would be much better because, well, essentially what's going on is you're building some pressure for a devaluation. If you devalue, if you do it, Argentina has a system of kind of a crawling peg, or let's say kind of when the exchange rate depreciates more at a certain amount per month. Roughly it's been depreciated at 2.7% per month. And the central bank, you know, each day depreciates 6 cents or 7 cents every day. So it sets the pace of depreciation. It's a sliding depreciation. Now, the question is, instead of depreciating at 2.7, if they depreciate at 5%, then they would reduce in the future the need to have a step depreciation and having a jump in prices. In my view, that would be a much better strategy. But for some reason, the central bank is not doing it. And I think that, you know, that they should have changed, especially once the real has depreciated dramatically from, you know, 4 reals per dollar to today is roughly 5.30 per dollar. And unfortunately, I mean, this is in the past, what the central bank was doing is when they saw the real depreciating, they accelerated the pace of depreciation of the peso. Unfortunately, they didn't do it. And this is one of the reasons why the parallel rate has gone up and people expect some depreciation in the future. But I agree. If you look at the kind of the central bank survey of economists, it's around 45. If you look at some private service, more broad private surveys, it's more like 40%. But the central bank is always worried that, you know, even if they accelerate the rate of depreciation, that could put additional pressure on prices. But that's going to come anyway. So it might be much better to do it now than wait. We have a huge trade surplus. At the moment, it's roughly $18 billion per year. So one of the paradoxes is you have a huge trade surplus, and yet the central bank cannot buy reserves. Over time, I think, you know, part of the huge trade surplus is based on the huge recession. I mean, economic activity, as everywhere, is going to drop probably 14% in the second quarter. We expect a drop closer to 11% or even more for the year as a whole. Typically when that happens, imports collapse. On top of that, you have a lot of import controls, which means that, you know, it's even more difficult to import. As the economy starts to grow, that is going to shrink. And if they don't depreciate the currency, it's going to shrink faster, because exports are not going to pick up, and there's going to be more incentive to import. Nevertheless, I think that on the whole, we expect that Argentina will maintain a trade surplus, perhaps not of 18 billion, but closer to 10 or 12 billion. Historically, Argentina had a trade surplus and a current account deficit. It has a surplus on goods and a deficit on services, interest payments, and dividends. So if you go to, say, a balanced current account, which is something of the balance of payments, which we could expect somewhat, when I'm saying medium term, okay, you see current account balance, and that would imply a surplus of roughly $12 billion, $10 to $12 billion, and a deficit on the service account of $10 to $12 billion. We'll have to see how things move, but I think that that's a likely scenario. Argentina, I think, will need a more competitive real exchange rate eventually, because we need to generate dollars and we need exports to increase. And with this exchange rate, it's not going to be enough to get the export boom. So probably Argentina needs some overshooting or kind of a very weak exchange rate for 3-4 years to get export moving, to get gain markets, and then perhaps it will appreciate a little bit.
On the debt question, I mean, how long can talks go on for? Do you think that, I know this is a little bit difficult to answer, and the non-disclosure agreements make everything kind of opaque, but do you think there could be another extension into August or even beyond that? And then just as a final question, you know, what do you see, where are the silver linings for Argentina? You know, where will recovery come from? If you look at the IMF figures, the recovery for 2021 looks pretty weak compared with the plunge that the economy will suffer this year. So, you know, where do you see the green shoots of recovery coming from?
Okay, first about the debt. I mean, this has been a kind of ever-ending story. I mean, it continues to linger and linger and linger. Why? I don't know. Honestly, I think at some point, everyone, I mean, we're so close that you think, well, why don't we really reach a deal and get it over? Especially for the government, because, you know, the government needs this in order to start concentrating on other issues. And really the differences are not so big on the financing, on the financial terms. Perhaps they're a little bigger on the legal terms, but if you give more on the financing terms, probably the bondholders are going to be less demanding on the legal issues. There could be another extension. Yes, there could be another extension. I mean, nothing guarantees that, you know, by July 24th, things are going to be behind us. I don't know. It's more important to see who is willing to really give up in terms of its demands. And Guzman, my sense, he hasn't been a good negotiator. He continues to be an academic with lots of ideology. And, you know, I remember when Caputo, the former minister of finance with Macri, Macri gave a very clear instruction to him. At the time he could fly, so he went to New York, and the instructions, don't come back until you have a deal. And, you know, in the end, the deal was able to make a deal. Obviously, probably he had to give more than he had in mind at the beginning, but, you know, he got the thing behind him, and you need that time of kind of more of, rather than academic, you need the doer. And unfortunately, Guzman is more an academic than a doer, and he came here with one mission in mind, which was to solve the debt, and yet he hasn't done it. So it could linger more, unfortunately. The other thing is whether, what could be the green shoots and how Argentina can grow. I mean, we're not talking about high growth, but basically going back to where we were, essentially. We're not talking about, you know, Argentina had the level of GDP, and today, essentially, everything is I mean, the aggregate demand went down. So it's more an issue of getting aggregate demand back rather than really thinking about big investments coming to Argentina and kind of moving the economy. And demand, in order to demand, I think what you need is getting confidence. I think if you deal with the debt, somehow you get inflation under control, which is not going to happen very quickly, but sometime it will happen. You don't interfere a lot with the private sector, so the private sector can start working again. I mean, that by itself is going to should get back the economy to where we was before. I mean, sectors, I mean, the service sector is very large. I mean, you have retail, which at the moment is completely paralyzed, started to move back, simply retail, just the production we had before. Now, to get growth, so that's kind of coming back. Now, to get medium-term growth and the economy growing, say, at 3-4%, probably it's more challenging. And that, in my view, depends very much on the business climate that the government managed to generate. And probably since there's no room for loose money or credit or fiscal stimulus, I think that the thing that you need is an undervalued currency for some time, as being kind of the driver to provide some growth, especially on the export side. The person leading which is the head of the statistics office, is the son of Lavagna. Lavagna is the former Minister of Finance of the Economy. He, I think, he's trying to be an independent. He has so far has maintained complete independence from the government. I think one of the things they learned from the previous administration is they don't want to kind of interfere with statistics or try to influence statistics. Even on poverty, even on growth, even on inflation, I think that I don't expect kind of messing up the numbers. I think that I'm more confident that they're not going to repeat that mistake, though we're paying a price because we cannot have a GDP warrant because there's a perception that the government manipulated the statistics in the past. At least that's while President Fernandez is there, I don't expect it. In terms of the central bank, clearly the central bank is not independent, hasn't been independent in Argentina for a long time. If you look in terms of the legal aspect, it is independent. In practice, hasn't been independent since 2000, since the 90s. Okay, in the 90s it was pretty independent, but since then, it's never been independent, not even with Macri. And my sense is that within that lack of independence, the central bank is doing a relatively good job in terms of avoiding printing too much money. I mean, money supply is going up, of course, but when you look at the monetary base, the central bank is sterilizing a lot of the money that it lends to the treasury. This is providing a lot of financing to the treasury, but then it sterilizes a lot of those pesos by issuing central bank debt, which is called LELIQs. That central bank debt is mainly held by banks. That's the difference from previous eras in which it was held by the public. But essentially, so far, the central bank has been prudent. That can change, yes. The central bank is many times, the governor of the central bank is many times under attack. But so far, I think he's run within the situation, of course, a prudent monetary policy.